Well, people are gathering for this session. I'll talk about myself briefly. I'm Art Dowell. I'm a principal process safety engineer at the Process Improvement Institute. I was with Roman Haas Company for 42 years. They're now part of the Dow Chemical Company. I've been in process safety consulting since 2009. Chemical engineer by training, Rice University, a fellow of AICHE, a member of ISA, chair and co-author of the CCPS Layer of Protection Analysis book, and received the Albert F. Sperry Founders Award in 2002 from ISA, the Mary Kay O'Connor Process Safety Merit Award in 2011, and the Bill Doyle Award from Loss Prevention for the best paper in 1991. And yes, I know I need a haircut. Avoided that during the pandemic. On a good hair day, I resemble Mark Twain late in life. On a bad hair day, it's more like Albert Einstein. Glad you're here. Welcome to this paper. Is your SIF trying to do too much? In the paper today, we'll look at an example of a complex SIF. We'll apply Loper principles. We'll split it into single scenario SIFs so we can deal with it. We'll show you a protocol for doing it and draw some conclusions. Here is an example of an SIF that's trying to do too much. It's a reformer shutdown, and it has all of the sensors and all of the final elements that have anything to do with this reformer shutdown issues. So we have 9 sensor groups over here. We have 3 final element groups. Our target PFD is 0.01, and the target safety integrity level is 2. So we've got a lot of stuff going on in this SIF. Now, one of the problems is the voting differs depending on the sensor group that triggers the SIF. Different combinations of sensor voting are required to vote 1 out of 2 or 2 out of 2. Likewise, different combinations of final element voting are required to vote 2 out of 2 or 2 out of 3. Additionally, we have a SIL verification software limitation. We used 2 different commercial software packages, and each of them are limited to a max of 4 voting groups for sensors and a max of 4 voting groups for final elements. Note for simplicity, inputs from upstream units that trip the reformer are not included. Actions that trip downstream units are not included in this example SIF, but they were there in the original SIF. Now, these items are considered as required for orderly shutdown. We thought, well, could we use fault tree analysis? We might be tempted to use the 1 out of 9 sensor voting groups, but voting 1 out of 9 gives a lower calculated PFD for the sensor than voting 1 out of 2 or 2 out of 3, as specified in the logic. It might also be tempting to assume the final element voting groups could vote as 1 out of 3, but for some sensor combinations, the final element groups are specified to vote 1 out of 2 or 2 out of 2. So we need a way to handle the complex logic here, and fault tree cannot do it. and the available SIL verification software will not do the calculations as needed. So our approach is to apply LOPA concepts. There are 8 different scenarios for the SIF to detect and prevent. We recall in LOPA, we evaluate one cause consequence pair, that is one scenario at a time. And then we determine what final elements protect against that scenario. We also determine what sensors detect that scenario. And with that information, we now know what IPLs protect against that scenario. An IPL, independent protection layer, includes final elements and sensors that trigger those final elements. It may be possible to identify these scenarios from a LOPA or a PHA, a process hazard analysis. So here are the 8 scenarios that we found listed with their consequences. And we see low flow of natural gas, damage to the reformer exchanger tubes, low steam flow to the reformer, coking damage to the reformer catalyst, low airflow to the reformer, fuel-rich gas in the furnace, possible explosions, low steam to carbon ratio in the reformer, feed, coking damage to the catalyst, high furnace box temperature or high furnace box pressure, loss of draft leading to fuel-rich gas in the reformer, low reformer steam drum level, overheat damage to reformer tubes, high temperature of the reformed gas, overheat damage to the reformer tubes, and finally, low pressure of the fuel gas, flame loss in the furnace, potential explosion of unburned fuel gas. So 8 different scenarios. So here's the table with the massive SIF split into single scenario SIFs. And we looked at the causes and consequences, or the sensors and consequences, on the previous slide. Now we'll show you a little bit about how we split these things up. We recognized that low flow of natural gas was an issue here. It could be detected by the 2 out of 3 flow transmitters, or it could be detected by an input signifying a trip of the natural gas compressor. Then we says, okay, what protects us from the consequence of low natural gas flow? And the answer is we've got to get the heat out of the reformer. So we closed the fuel gas USVs, shutdown valves. We have 2 of those. We tripped the flue gas fan and we tripped the combustion air fan. So we take the fuel and the air out of the furnace. And then we ask ourselves the question, are there any more final elements that specifically would prevent the consequence from low natural gas? And our conclusion is anything else is for orderly shutdown. But these sensors and these final elements detect and prevent this one scenario. Then we take a look at SIF 01, number 2. And if we lose the reformer steam, or we have low flow of steam to the reformer, then we can detect that from the natural gas feed to the reformer steam, because that's in ratio with the steam flow. And we have 3 transmitters voting 2 out of 3. And then we look at the final elements. We're going to take the fuel gas out just as we did above. We're going to trip the natural gas flow valves and the natural gas shutdown valve. And then we'll also trip the flue gas fan and the combustion air fan. So we take the natural gas out of the furnace, and we take the heat sources out of the furnace. So now we go to number 3, which is low reformer airflow. And one sensor is combustion air fan stopped. Another sensor is the flue gas fan stopped. So these are the two motive sources for combustion air. And if we don't have combustion air, we need to turn off the fuel, and we have the two fuel gas shutdown valves. Number 4 is low ratio of steam to carbon going into the reformer catalyst. And so we have the natural gas 2 out of 3 voting, and we have the steam 2 out of 3 voting. And those are our detection. And to prevent the consequence here, we need to turn the heat off. So that's trip the fuel gas and the combustion air. And we need to trip the natural gas going into the catalyst side of the reformer. And so we have the 2 flow valves and the USV shutdown valve. And we don't need any other final elements to prevent this consequence. The sub-SIF number 5, we're concerned about high furnace box pressure because that indicates that the flue gas fan is probably stopped or malfunctioning. And we're going to overheat the catalyst. So that can be detected by the furnace box high pressure switch. We have, or transmitter, and we have two out of 3 voting there, and the flue gas fan is stopped. So the final elements are to turn the fuel gas off and turn off the combustion air fan. So that gets the heat out of the system. And number 6 is low level in the steam drum. We're going to damage the boiler tubes. So we have the steam drum low level, voting 2 out of 3. And if the flue gas fan is stopped, that's also bad. So those two sensor groups, we need to get the heat out. So we trip the fuel gas going into the furnace, and we trip the natural gas going into the reformer catalyst. And those are familiar final element groups. Then we come to number 7, where we trip the reformer. We're concerned about a trip from high temperature of the reformed gas. And we measure that temperature, 2 out of 3 voting. We need to get the heat out of the system. So we trip the fuel gas, and here we show we're tripping the 2 shutdown valves as well as the natural gas to the catalyst. And then finally, number 8 is concern is fuel gas low pressure. We measure that, 2 out of 3 voting on the transmitters. And if that happens, we're going to trip the fuel gas, where we trip both USV shutdown valves. And so that's a quick look into the way that we develop the single scenario SIFs. So here's the protocol to identify SIFs that are trying to do too much. If the SIF includes all the sensors and final elements that are involved in any trip of a large processing unit, that's a trigger. If the SIF includes actions to shut down upstream units that are feeding this unit, if the SIF involves actions to shut down downstream units fed by this unit, if the SIF has more than 3 process variables as inputs, if the SIF has more than 2 final element actions All of these are triggers. Good engineering judgment is required. These quantities of inputs and actions may not be completely rigorous, but they give us a good starting point. Continuing the protocol, we determine if the sensors and final elements are protecting against multiple scenarios. And for additional information, we can consult the process hazard analysis and the layer of protection analysis for the facility. Now we move from identification to correction. So here's this SIF that's trying to do too much. How do we correct it? Well, we're going to separate it into one scenario sub-SIFs. So we want to select all of the sensors that can detect that specific scenario and only those sensors, those sensor groups. We want to select the minimum final elements that can prevent the specific scenario and only those final element groups. We want to omit sensors or final elements that do not detect or prevent the specific scenario. They are there for orderly shutdown. We want to perform the SIL verification calculations for each sub-SIF. And then we want to confirm that all of the sensors and final elements for the massive SIF have been included in the sub-SIFs. So we conclude that any sensor that attempts to protect against too many scenarios and lumps too many sensors and final elements together into one SIF will not have the desired probability of failure on demand or this desired safety and integrity level. An example was presented showing how to split up a massive reformer SIF into reasonably sized sub-SIFs, and a protocol was outlined for the work process. Thank you for listening. Any questions, we'll address those through the chat.